The cup that I drink. The series of lessons we've been having when I've been up here have had to do with questions that Jesus asked various people, the disciples or others. I know Larry has participated in this series as well. And he asks a question that we read this morning: are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Now, I'd like to spend some time thinking about that question. And he asked, are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? I want to think about that, drink that in, so to speak. No pun there. No one got that. We're going to drink this cup this morning and see if we can understand what's going on here. Now, over 10 years ago, someone pointed out to me that in the Gospel of Mark in particular, but I think you see this in Matthew too, Jesus makes these three predictions of his upcoming death and resurrection. And immediately after these three predictions, Mark relates an incredible failing of the disciples. And then immediately after that failing of the disciples, Mark relates Jesus giving a teaching about what it means to be a follower of Christ, in particular what it means to be a servant in the kingdom. And you find that pattern three times. Jesus predicts his upcoming death, the disciples fail in some horrible, miserable way, and then Jesus gives a teaching about discipleship, in particular about being a servant in the kingdom. Three predictions, three failures, three admonitions, and I filed that away in the back of my mind as something I want to study one day, because that is fascinating. Why does Mark do that? There's got to be a reason, and I think there is a reason, and so we're cashing in that check that someone else planted in my brain over 10 years ago this morning. Three predictions, three failures, and three admonitions, and if we were to look at them, they occur in Mark chapter 8, Mark chapter 9, and Mark chapter 10, all towards the back of the chapter. Now, the Gospel of Mark largely is divided into two halves, up to Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ there in Mark chapter 8. And in the first half of Mark, you might call that part the gospel of popularity. Jesus is performing miracles. He's well received. He's well liked by the masses. He's growing a following. And then starting in Mark chapter 8, Jesus begins in Mark's relaying of the events kind of a long journey towards Jerusalem, where he's ultimately crucified, buried, and raised. And so that's the second half. We might think of that as the gospel of rejection. First half, he's popular. Second half, he's rejected. And right in the middle is the pronouncement of Peter that you are the Christ in Mark chapter 8. And then after that, Jesus gives these three predictions. And so a big part of the remaining part of Mark, or at least of the next three chapters, is framed around these three predictions that Jesus gives that he is going to be crucified. So the first is in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. And the prediction, so he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things, and he goes on and elaborates. And then right after that, you have an incredible failure of one of the apostles. Peter turns to Jesus. We'll look at these in detail. And he rebukes Jesus, and Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And then after that, Jesus gives his famous teaching that if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. That's right after Peter's failing there. The second occurs towards the end of Mark chapter 9. Jesus, again, the Bible is very clear that this is a pattern, because it says that, again, Jesus told them that he's going to be crucified. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and so forth. And then right after that, you have the apostles failing again, because they have an argument about who is the greatest. And then Jesus gives another one of those famous teachings that we've heard all of our life. And if you're like me, you heard them without really understanding they fit into a grid, this chart, until someone pointed this out to me. He says, if anyone would be first, he must be last. And of course, there's more that he says there. And then the third is at the end of Mark chapter 10, which is what we read this morning. He says, the third time, and the scriptures are clear. They're giving us, it's not just like we find these random predictions. It's very clear in Scripture. This is the first, this is the second, and this is the third. Giving us a kind of a clue that, hey, there's something here going on. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and he goes on to describe his upcoming death. And then you have the failure of the disciples, where James and John come to Jesus and ask to sit at his left and right hand when he enters into his kingdom. And then the disciples, of course, when you go to Matthew, you realize that their mother was involved in this. But Mark doesn't give us that detail. And then the other disciples are indignant. They're mad at James and John. You have this failing of all kinds of failures that go on in that whole ordeal. And then Jesus gives the famous teaching that we read this morning: whoever would be great among you must be your servant. The Gentiles lord it over, they lord it over their subjects, but it's not to be so among you. So you have this grid, this pattern: prediction of the cross, a failure of the disciples, and then an admonition or a teaching about being a servant. And what is that for? What is the Bible telling us? What is God communicating to us through the narrative of these three events, through these three failures, through these three admonitions? Well, I think we're going to see, and I won't bury the lead here, what we're going to see is that Jesus is giving a teaching on cross-shaped discipleship. Because remember, the second half of the Gospel of Mark is all framed around their journey to Jerusalem where Jesus is crucified. And that's why 3 times on the road he says, we're going there not just to have fun and party, but we're going there so that I can be crucified. And then you have failures of these disciples that illustrate that they don't understand at all what the cross is about. And the final verse of this section of 3, we read this morning, it's a famous verse. It's one that children commit this one to memory. It's a great verse. Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Which of course fits into this theme of service that you see in these 3 events. Servant of all, slave of all, must be last. Cross-shaped discipleship. The cross, as we see, I hope we see this morning, sets the example of what Christian behavior looks like. If you go through the letters of Paul, for instance, almost every moral teaching that you find in his letters, he connects back to the cross in some way. Even things as you would think unrelated, like the offering we just partook in this morning, the collection, rather. In the collection, Paul tells them in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 that Jesus Christ became poor for your sake so that you might become rich. And he takes Jesus and his sacrificial life and death and sets that as an example for us and then uses that to inform even our giving. So every area of the Christian life is informed, is shaped by the cross. The cross sets the example of Christian behavior, and the disciples set the example of how to not follow that. They fail miserably at following in the pattern of the cross. Well, let's look at each of these 3 this morning. The first, in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38, you can follow along on your screen or on your smartphone or if you have a Bible with you. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. This was no mystery, no parable, no apocalyptic enigma. It was plain as day. Hey boys, we're going to Jerusalem. And when we get there, I'm going to be killed. And after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. Now, to understand a little bit about the setup here, earlier in Mark, they have been up north. They've been in Caesarea Philippi. That's where Peter makes his great confession of faith that you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus is transfigured very likely on Mount Hermon. There's all kinds of debate about whether or not that happened. But we know Jesus is in Caesarea, or whether or not that happened at Mount Hermon. It happened, but it could have been in a different mountain. But we know that they're up in this region at Caesarea Philippi. And if you follow Mark's narrative, now if you go to John and you start doing the harmony of the 4 Gospels, you'll find that it's a little, Jesus goes to a few other places. It's a little more complicated than the way we'll show it this morning. But in general, this is what happens. Jesus starts heading back down to Galilee. He travels through Galilee and he crosses over into Perea, and then he crosses back over the Jordan River, comes to Jericho, and then from Jericho he enters into Jerusalem for Passover weekend. Now he does move around and do some other things, but that's in Matthew and Mark, that's the sense you're going to get, and in Luke as well. Jesus is up here. He's transfigured. Peter confesses that he's the Christ. This is the pinnacle of Christ's ministry, and it literally happens up on a mountain. This is Jesus, the Son of God, transfigured before us. We can see him as he is, and surely this is going to be the moment when Jesus is revealed and all the nations repent and turn to him, and we live in one great happy utopia. That may be what you would have thought if you were there, but that's not what happens, because he takes this long road all the way down to Jericho and then down to Jerusalem, where he is crucified. It's not exactly the ending to that story that you would have expected. And so here we are. We're back in Mark chapter 8. Jesus is setting out. They've got a long journey in front of them that's going to take them a while to complete. And he's telling them what the point is. He says it plainly. We're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will suffer. He will be rejected. He will be killed, and 3 days later he will rise. That's the first time. Now Peter commits one of the most mind-boggling blunders a person could ever commit. Now, we're going to see in the second and third times that Jesus predicts his upcoming death that the disciples are amazed and afraid, and they're too scared to ask Jesus. And it might just be that they're scared to ask Jesus because they saw what happened to Peter when Peter tried to step in and do something the first time. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. But turning and seeing the disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." I remember as a kid, probably Paul's age, maybe younger, hearing one of our elders who's long passed away preach on this text. And I don't remember his sermon, I don't remember his points, but I do remember him saying something like, whenever you're facing temptation or challenge, you can think these words, "Get behind me, Satan." And I remember as a kid, I was a very fearful child in a lot of ways. When I'd go to bed, I had 3 things I'd pray for every night. I'd pray that there wouldn't be a tornado that'd come hit the house. I'd pray that the house wouldn't catch on fire. And I got to remember, for me, a lot of people we knew had their houses burned down, including my wife's family. I didn't know them back then, but their house burned down, and we knew some other people whose home burned down. So just in my young, impressionable mind, I thought, well, any day this place is going to go up in flames. This is how it works. And then I prayed that we wouldn't be robbed. Those are my 3 prayers. And I would lay in bed, and I'd be scared of the inevitable fire that's, starting in the attic. And I would think, as I'm afraid, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan." This is what I heard at church. Now you might be thinking, that's not at all what Jesus is communicating here, and that would be right. But even as a child, I learned an important lesson. This is why you got to bring your kids to church. Even if you don't understand all that the preacher is saying, you learn things. And I learned that Jesus is in charge of Satan and can rebuke him, because Satan has no authority against Jesus. Now, what is going on here? So Peter hears Jesus say, well, we're going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to kill the Son of Man. He said it plainly, and I'm going to rise from the dead. And Peter rebuked, "Lord, what are you talking about? We just saw you. I just confessed that you are the Christ. We've seen you do all these miracles. We know who you are. The Christ isn't supposed to be killed. What are you talking about, Jesus? You're going to make me look like an idiot because I just told the other apostles that you're the Christ of God." And so he began to rebuke Jesus. But then Jesus sees it says that Peter took Jesus aside. So Jesus and Peter are having this private conversation. But evidently it's within view of the apostles, because Jesus turns and sees the other 11 standing over there, probably looking over at Jesus and Peter thinking, what's going on? And so Jesus sees the disciples, and he turned and rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter had all kinds of ideas about who Jesus was and what Jesus would do, and the inevitable defeat of the Romans that would come at Jesus' sword. This is probably what Peter's thinking. This is what all the Jews thought. And Jesus says that these are the things of man and not the things of God. You see, the Son of Man came not to be served, that is, to be a king up on a throne with all his subjects around him on their knees bringing tribute. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the things of God. But Peter's not thinking about the things of God. He's thinking about the things of man. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't understand what you're talking about. There's a plan here that involves the cross." And so what's Peter doing? Well, you might say, first of all, that he's presumptuous. And that's very bold. I mean, even if you were confused at what Jesus had to say, it takes a man with a lot of bold stupidity to take the person that he just confessed was the Christ and pull him aside and rebuke him. I mean, what? How presumptuous do you have to be? It takes a certain amount of denial. I mean, Jesus just said, "I'm going to go do this," and I don't know. I don't know about that, God. I don't know about that, Jesus. I know you said it, but I don't. He's kind of in denial about what God wants, and it's certainly wrong-headed. It's putting all the priorities in the wrong place. All the things that Peter wanted to have happen, and not the things that God has ordained to have happened. That's what Peter's got. He's completely wrong-headed. And so Jesus is going to then give a teaching about proper discipleship. You see, the disciples failed. They did not exhibit proper discipleship, Peter in this case. And so Jesus is going to give a teaching about what real discipleship looks like. And here's what he says. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now that has so much more meaning when you understand what's going on in the Gospels. Because literally, Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to be crucified. And if you want to be my disciple, you better join in the train. You better take up your cross and follow me. You can't run from the cross. You've got to embrace the cross if you want to be my disciple. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the Gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. What's going on here? Well, Jesus says if you really want to be my disciple, first of all, you've got to follow. You can't be like Peter and boss me around. Jesus is the divine Son of God. He is fulfilling the will of the Father. And if you want to be a disciple, a cross-shaped disciple, you've got to first recognize, as he says, take up your cross and follow me. The real disciple is mission-minded. What does he say? But whoever loses his life for my sake and the Gospel's. If you're going to be able to take that long road to Calvary with Jesus, if you're going to follow on that road, you've got to be focused on the mission. And if you're not bought into the mission of the gospel and God's plan to redeem the world through the gospel, you'll never make it on the road to Jerusalem. That's what he means when he says, take up your cross and follow me. And there's an old Southern gospel song. It was my favorite version of it. It was redone by Merle Haggard, called On the Jericho Road. We used to sing it sometimes, not in our book anymore. And it's a song that, as a kid you sing and you're like, I have no idea what this is about, but it's kind of a fun bopping song. The idea, though, the Jericho Road is that road they took across the Jordan River to Jericho and then down in Jerusalem. That's the road to the cross. In the song On the Jericho Road, there's room for just two. In other words, you've got to walk that road with Jesus. It's Jesus and you. And if you're going to be a proper disciple, you've got to take up your cross and follow him all the way. And if you're going to do it, you've got to be mission-minded and you've got to be unashamed. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words. Peter evidently was ashamed of Jesus and his words. That's why he pulls Jesus aside and says, Jesus, this can't be. It's never going to be. It says, if you're ashamed of me and of my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of you. And if you're going to walk that Jericho road and take up your cross, you have to be unashamed. You have to be proud of Jesus and of his words, never apologizing for what Jesus said or did or believed or commands. All right, second time. So skip ahead to towards the end of the next chapter. There's intervening material. And I would love someone to outline that because maybe there is structure in their intervening material. But at the end of chapter 9, we come back to part 2 of this saga, of this trilogy. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. So they're continuing. They were up north of Galilee, and now they're down in Galilee, so they're heading south. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. For he was teaching his disciples and saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. So here they are in Galilee. This is the second prediction. And he doesn't want anyone to know. I mean, he's got places to be and things to do, and he can't get sidetracked. So he doesn't want anyone to know. He's traveling through, and he tells them again, I'm going to be delivered into the hands of men. I will be killed, and 3 days later, I will rise. But verse 32, they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. I can understand that. And when they came to Capernaum, so now they've come to the Sea of Galilee, And when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Now put this side by side what we just read. The Bible says, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them. So they're on the road, and on the road he's saying, listen, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be killed and rise 3 days later. Meanwhile, on that road, on the journey, it's like they're listening with ears to what Jesus has to say, and when he's done, he turns and he's leading the pack, and then they turn back to themselves and start bickering and fighting about who is the greatest. Now, it's interesting to me in verse 34 that they kept silent. Jesus says, what were you guys talking about on the way? Were you talking about what I told you? I told you I'm going to be killed and rise from the dead. Were you thinking about that? Were you imagining what it means to follow me like I told you last chapter? Well, he knew, and they knew. And I think they knew that he knew because they kept silent. They're ashamed. They knew they shouldn't have been fighting about who was the greatest, but here they are. They're going to Jerusalem. And instead of accepting the fact that Jesus is going there not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, they think they're going there so that he can establish his kingdom and he can be king. And they want to know that when all this happens, who is the top dog? Who is the greatest? Many failures happen here. Number one, they didn't understand. They're confused. They were afraid to ask him. I'm sure if they would have asked with a humble heart, Jesus would have gladly told them once again, I'm going to Jerusalem to be killed and raised after 3 days. But they were confused, they were afraid, and to make all that much worse, they were filled with pride and self-ambition about who's going to be the top dog, who's going to be the leader. They were prideful enough to have this fight, but they were aware how wrong it was because when Jesus brings it up, they're silent. Kind of scared. That's a really destructive combination, I think. Being afraid and prideful and confused and afraid to learn what you need to learn, but too prideful to really take any advice should it be offered to you in any event. When I was in 8th grade, I wanted to be a rock star. I had a guitar. I learned how to play guitar, and I formed a rock band with my friends. And we had another friend who was our singer, and he wasn't that good of a singer, but he was our singer. And we tried out for the school's talent show. We wrote a song. He was very nervous when we tried out. He wouldn't sing into the mic, and so it just was basically us playing very bad guitar, very loud drums in the junior high cafeteria with our singer. He's holding the words right here, and he's just barely kind of mumbling into the mic. And so we knew, the band convened after, and we knew that we got to kick this guy out. We got to, it's like the Beatles when they got rid of Pete Best, their original drummer, because he was too good looking, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney just couldn't have someone better looking than them in the band, so they had to kick. Well, it wasn't for that reason, but we had to kick him out of the band. So, we were prideful enough to think that we were certainly better at what we were doing than he was. But we were afraid to kick him out of the band because he's our friend, kind of our friend, and we didn't really want to make him mad. So we devised the greatest plan ever. We said, we're just going to disband. We met, we had a good run, didn't work out, didn't make the talent show, so we're going to have to disband. And then the next day, we reformed a new band with 4 of the 5 and didn't invite him to participate. Of course, he found out, and for the rest of our time in high school, he and I were never that close. Prideful. It's, like we were any better, but that's what we thought. But we were afraid to sit and say, hey, man, it's not working out. We should have just kicked him out of the band, as unpleasant as that would have been, or just given up our dreams. That would have probably been smarter. But pride and fear are really, they're a combination that makes you do all kinds of really weird things. And clearly the disciples succumbed to that horrible combination here. And so Jesus gives a second teaching. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." Now the teaching is short, but the object lesson goes on with this child. If you want to be first. Now that's what they're fighting about. You know, when we get to Jerusalem, who's going to be the top dog around here? Who's going to be the chief of staff? They're trying to appoint themselves to Jesus' cabinet, basically, and they're trying to figure out who's going to be the top brass. And Jesus says, listen, if you want to be first, if you really want to be first or great in a place of preeminence, then you must be last. You must be servant of all. Because here's Jesus, the one who truly is first. He is the top dog. And what's he doing? He's going to the cross. And so then Jesus gives them an object lesson to teach them, to show them. And he takes a child, puts him in his arms, and he says, if you receive one such child, you receive me. In my name, you receive me. And if you receive me, you don't just receive me, you receive the Father who sent me. Now, what's that about? Our society treats children a lot better than past societies treated children. Now, you might think, is this because we're much wiser and better and smarter? No, not really, because our society treats the elderly far worse than the past generations treated the elderly. So we've just made a trade. We've said that kids are kind of the boss around here, and the older folks. In broad society, this is what happens. You don't see them on TV. They kick George Jones off of the CMAs, so they can put in the young guys. That's just how society is. We prize youth and beauty really above all else. But in their society, it was not that way. Children were to be seen and not heard, and maybe sometimes not even seen. Children were the bottom of the rung. They didn't have a place in society of any position or prominence. You see on TV that whenever there's some political or social cause, a lot of times they'll bring out a child who's speaking passionately about some social cause as if listen to the children, what about the children? Well, in their day, that would have never have worked because they would have said, that's a child. Why would I listen to a child? Children know nothing. That was their world. And Jesus takes the person who is at the lowest rung on the ladder in society. What does Paul say in Galatians chapter 4? That a child differs not at all from a slave under the authority of the man of the house until the time appointed by the father. So there's a time a child becomes a man and kind of is his own thing. But when the child is living at the house, in terms of social status, they're like a slave. And Jesus takes this child, brings him in, and says, you need to receive someone like this at the very bottom of the social ladder. Receive them, accept them, welcome them as he takes this child into his arms. And they would have understood that image. That Jesus is saying all the things you think that are required to be important and prominent in this life, turn them over, flip them on their head. Be last of all and servant of all, just like a child. And so what's going on here? Jesus is inviting his disciples to be servant-hearted, be servant of all, and humble. All right, part 3 of the trilogy, Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 45. And when they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, so they've progressed, right? They're now heading toward Jerusalem. And when they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Now again, it's plain as day. And I do point out that they were both afraid and amazed. Now they're also amazed at the fact that Jesus was walking ahead of them. So what does it say? They were going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. So Jesus has been saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be killed, and here's Jesus out in front of the line, leading the charge into Jerusalem, so to speak. And that was amazing, and kind of made him afraid. Like, is this guy crazy? Why wouldn't he be kind of dragging his feet thinking like, I really don't want to do this. I'll kind of lumber into Jerusalem right before Passover. No, he's out in the front. It's amazing, and it caused them to be afraid. Then he tells them very plainly, in very vivid detail, what's going to happen to him when he is in Jerusalem. And then we have the third failure. We read this morning. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Now, that's how you know the question about to follow is a bad question. Before I tell you what I'm going to ask you, I need you to commit that you're going to do whatever I ask. And Jesus, of course, is wise and doesn't say, "Yeah, sure, what do you want?" We want wings and we want to be able to breathe fire. Jesus doesn't say that. He says, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand, one at your left, in your glory." This is how we know that they don't understand what's about to happen. They're on their way to Jerusalem, and they think that this is going to be a moment of glory in the human sense. Jesus is going to be elevated to a throne, and he's going to have thrones on his left or right, and let us sit at your left and right hand in your glory. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We're able." I don't think they had a clue what Jesus just said. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Now Jesus uses two metaphors here to describe what's going to happen in Jerusalem. The first one makes a lot of sense. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? And the metaphor of the cup comes up a lot in the Gospels. Jesus says there in Gethsemane to let this cup pass from me. Well, what is that about? You go back to the Old Testament, on many occasions, the Bible talks about the cup of staggering or the cup of God's wrath. And that was well known to the Jews. You drink the cup of God's wrath, that means you are enduring the punishment of God, God's wrath being poured out of his cup. Isaiah 51, one such place. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Now, I don't know what they heard, but Jesus is, I believe, making a clear allusion to his upcoming death at Jerusalem. The cup that I drink, the cup of God's wrath. I'm not going there to receive the cup of a king, the cup of victory. I'm going there to drink from the cup of God's wrath. But then he turns to a second metaphor, which I am convinced they absolutely did not understand, and I don't know that we fully understand it. Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? Now, unlike the cup, there is not this very prominent theme in the Old Testament about baptism associated with God's wrath. There's maybe one reference in the Septuagint in the first part of Isaiah 22, I think. Maybe, but I'm quite confident that's not what Jesus was alluding to, and they certainly didn't pick up on that. So what in the world is going on here? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? Now, we know they don't understand because they quickly say, "We are able." And we know that Jesus is talking about the cup of God's wrath. But what in the world is going on with the baptism? Now, at the surface level, in the context, we know that this is a metaphor pointing to the death of Jesus and the wrath he's going to undertake. And he describes it as an immersion. This is I'm going to be submerged in this. Not just drinking from it, but submerged in this. That is obvious. This is a clear pointer, and when Jesus said these words, to his upcoming death at Jerusalem. But whenever we study the Gospels, we have to ask ourselves three questions. Number one, particularly with the word of Jesus, why did Jesus say it? And I think that's pretty clear. He said it because he's about to endure a wrath. But number two, why did Mark preserve it? And that's a challenging question sometimes. Remember what John says, that the works of Jesus are so numerous that all the books in the world couldn't contain them. So the apostles, and the early disciples, as they're through the Holy Spirit writing these books, are having to make editorial decisions. What do we include? What can we not say for the sake of space? And so it is an important question to say, why did Jesus say it? But why did Mark preserve this particular saying? Of all the things Jesus said he didn't say, why this one? And then third, why was it preserved down to this day? There were other early documents, some that may have gone to the apostles themselves, that contained written words of Jesus that we have lost. There's some early church testimony to that fact, and so it wasn't preserved. So why did Jesus say it? Why did Mark record it? And why is it still preserved by the Holy Spirit down to us this day? And it's the second and third questions as it relates to this that really fascinate me. Jesus said it because he's about to face God's wrath. But perhaps Jesus also said it, and Mark also recorded it, because drinking the cup and being baptized are the two Christian practices that all Christians must engage in order to be united with Christ. And that's what he's talking about. You want to follow me? You want to take up your cross and follow me and be united to me in my kingdom? Well, you've got to drink the cup and you've got to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. And so I believe Mark is recording this for us, and Jesus says it with the foreknowledge because he knows that his first century audience who picks up this letter is going to make the very obvious connection to the Lord's Supper and to baptism. I think the same is true in John chapter 3 with being born of water and the Spirit, and in John chapter 6 with drinking the blood of Jesus. Was Jesus referring specifically about communion in John chapter 6? I don't think so. But when John wrote those words, he knew that his audience would connect those dots. There's no doubt in my mind. And the early church did. And I think Mark does the same. He knows the same thing. So with that in mind, what we have here is an onion. We have a teaching of Jesus that has layers. And at the core of that onion is the fact that Jesus is going to Jerusalem, and he's going to endure a death, and he uses the metaphor of the cup, and he uses the metaphor of the baptism to describe the coming death. But as we look at the other layers of that onion, what we see here is that James and John, if you want to have union with Christ, there are two Christian practices that all Christians have to face, except that will help you do it. And not only will they unite you with Christ, they will unite you with Christ's death and resurrection at Jerusalem. When we partook of the Lord's Supper this morning, we were, what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 10? Participants in the body and blood of Jesus. When we are baptized, what does Paul say in Romans chapter 6? That we are baptized into his death. There is a union between the gospel reality of the death and resurrection of Jesus and when we participate in the cup and in the baptism. I absolutely believe Mark intends for his reader to connect a few dots there. So that's the onion. Now, they say we're able. We are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. And someone says, well, see, that just means that James and John are going to be martyred. Well, James was martyred, but we don't think John was martyred. We think he died in exile. So maybe what Jesus is saying here is more than, well, I'm going to be martyred and you're going to be martyred. Maybe Jesus is saying something even more fundamental than that. That what I am going to the cross to do, if you want to be my disciple, you must follow and do as well. Maybe not literally be martyred in the case of John, but you certainly must take up a cross-shaped life. If you want to follow me into my glory, your life has to look a lot different than it's been looking. It must, Jesus says, look like his. But to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. How dare you? I mean, weren't the disciples just arguing about who was going to be the greatest? And here's James and John. At least they have the courage to go to Jesus and ask. I don't think the other 10 were any better. I don't think they were any better. Why would they be indignant at James and John for this? Because if Jesus would have said, yeah, sure, you can sit at my right and left hand, then it's certainly his will. And who are they to withstand the will of the Son of God? But Jesus says no in this case, so I don't know that in being mad or indignant or puffed up is the right response. I mean, if anything, it would be a little bit like, ha ha. He said it's for whom it's prepared, and clearly it's not prepared for you. Nanny, nanny, boo-boo. I mean, that's, I think, what I would have responded with. But they're mad. How dare you be so presumptuous to go and do this thing? So what do we have here? Well, we have a failure of self-promotion. James and John did not need to ask this. You go over to Matthew's account where James and John's mother is involved in this, it gets even more embarrassing that she goes to Jesus and facilitates this question. It's certainly thoughtless. They say, oh yeah, we're able to drink the cup you drink. We're able to drink to be baptized with the baptism with which you're baptized. Yeah, we are all about that, Jesus. We are going to do what you do, and we're going to go with you wherever you go. They have no idea what they're asking. And then the other 10 are envious. How dare you go and ask Jesus this question? And so then Jesus gives the final teaching in this trilogy. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is Jesus dropping the mic, so to speak. This is Jesus saying, you guys have really missed the plot. You do not understand what's going on. If you want to be important, it has to look very different than you think it looks. You can't be acting like the nations who lord it over them and exercise great authority. Those two, in the Greek, it's very clear parallelism. It might suggest that Jesus originally spoke this in Aramaic because there's a certain poetic structure to this. You know that those who are considered rulers, the big dogs, the primary people, they lord it over them. They exercise authority, and that word exercise authority and lord it over has with it the connotations of subdue. They conquer. They put them under their boot, and when they have them under their control, then they exercise their authority. They essentially do it through force. That's what the Gentiles are doing. The Gentiles only know how to be boss by being big, bad, scary, and powerful, and they use force. They lord it over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great, you want to be great, you must be your servant. Whoever would be first must be slave of all. Now, it is important to note that Jesus has escalated the language. Because here, in the second part of the trilogy, he says last of all and servant of all. That's the word we get deacon from, just a servant. Diakonos. But here, Jesus starts with servant, and he says, you must be slave of all. And that's the word doulos. In Greek is a stronger word. And it means something like a bond servant. If you were impoverished, you had the ability to sell yourself into slavery for 7 years and to be someone's slave. Now, the reason it's important that we understand that this isn't talking about a servant, a hired servant, could leave at any time. They're really just an employee, but a slave was bound in Roman law at least for 7 years. And if you were a servant to one of the Caesars or to their household, it was for 14 years was your term. And so he says, you must be slave of all. You don't even have a choice in this. You must totally put yourself at the bottom of the rung and serve everyone else. If you want to be great, you have to be a slave. Why? Because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You guys don't understand. I'm not going to Jerusalem to be king. I'm going to Jerusalem to be a servant. I'm not going to Jerusalem to receive tribute and payment. I'm going to Jerusalem to be the tribute and payment. You don't get it. And if you want to be great, as Jesus is great, you have to follow in that cross-shaped activity. And so what we see in parts 1, 2, and 3 of this trilogy are Jesus saying, I'm going to be crucified. The disciples saying, well, who's going to be the best? Who's going to be the greatest? And failing miserably. And Jesus saying, listen, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me. Cross-shaped discipleship. And so what it means to follow Christ is we cannot follow Christ in the way that Christ wants on this Jericho road if we are presumptuous, in denial, and wrong-headed, if we are confused, afraid, and prideful, if we are self-promoting, thoughtless, and envious. These were the failures of the 12 apostles. They had all of these attitudes in their heart on the road to the cross. And you might think, well, surely they got it figured out. Maybe when they got there and saw the cross and saw the Romans, they would get it all figured out. No. Mark tells us when they get there, in chapter 14, verse 50, they all left him and fled. On the road to the cross, their heart was filled with all the wrong attitudes. And then when they had to confront the reality of the cross, they fled. They weren't ready to take up their cross and follow Jesus. But if we want to, on the other hand, be a follower of Christ in a cross-shaped way, we must be, first of all, a follower. We're not leading, we're following, taking up our cross. We're mission-minded. What does he say? For the sake of the gospel. We're unashamed, not afraid. We're servant-hearted. We're humble. We are unlike the nations who lord it over. We are bondservants, yes, but we are also self-sacrificing. Just as Jesus Christ came to give his life as a ransom for many. If we want to be a follower of Jesus, we have to find all the things that were in Jesus that led him to the cross and embody those in our life. This is the lesson of the morning. I hope it's been beneficial to you. I hope you understand a little bit more about this trilogy. I certainly learned a lot in this study to see why these three things are told the way they are in Mark and in Matthew. The call to be a Christian is a call to follow Christ. It is not a call to have all the riches of the world. It is not a call to prominence and authority. But it is a call to lay down your arms and to take up your cross. And we invite you to do that this morning. If you need the help of the church in any way, or if you would like to put the Lord on in baptism, won't you come as we stand and sing